A story you'll definitely want to hear to the end. Enjoy listening. Chapter 1. In the damp gloom of a living room, where heavy velvet curtains seemed to soak up the very light, a scene worthy of an absurdist playwright was unfolding. Arthur, his face slick with self-satisfaction, threw a thick sheet of paper onto the lacquered surface of the bird's-eye maple table with a theatrical flourish. Beside him, perched like a bird of prey, sat his mother, Barbara, her beady eyes glittering with unconcealed greed. "Here, my dear, sign this, and we'll go our separate ways," Arthur rumbled, his voice saturated with the cloying confidence unique to people who believe unshakably in their own irresistibility. "It's time to end this show." Elizabeth, his wife, looked up from an ancient leather-bound book. She surveyed him and her mother-in-law with a long, inscrutable gaze that made Arthur momentarily uneasy. There was no fear or hysteria in her dark brown, almost black eyes, only a cold, detached curiosity, as if she were observing the behavior of bizarre insects. "A show, you say?" Her voice was surprisingly calm, even melodious, which clashed with the ultimatum of the moment. "Interesting. Are you sure you know who the director of this show is?" Barbara shifted impatiently on the edge of the antique armchair, its upholstery worth more than all her family jewels combined. "Lizzie, don't be sarcastic. Arthur has decided everything. The business, this house, the cars, the accounts, everything split down the middle, fair and square. We're family after all." "Family," Elizabeth repeated, and the word dripped with such icy irony that a chill ran down Arthur's spine. He knew that tone all too well. It preceded catastrophes, not petty quarrels, but full-blown disasters, after which his world had to be pieced back together. He remembered how she had started, with a tiny studio in a basement on the outskirts of the city. He had laughed then, calling it a bored housewife's little hobby. He, the son of a professor and a promising research fellow himself, had condescendingly allowed her to dabble in this nonsense. And then the nonsense grew into a chain of fashion houses across the country and then beyond. Her name became a brand, synonymous with luxury and impeccable taste. And he remained promising. His academic career never took off, and for the last 10 years, his only job had been husband to Elizabeth Sterling, and that position, he believed, should be handsomely compensated. "Listen, you two parasites," Elizabeth said suddenly, setting the book aside. Her voice lost its melodic quality, becoming as sharp and hard as Damascus steel. The room seemed to instantly grow cold. "Did you really think that I, who built this empire with my own 2 hands, would give half of it to you? To you, a lazy, talentless drone who has never earned a dime in his life? And to you, Barbara, whose only achievement is giving birth to this specimen?" Arthur's face turned purple. He had expected tears, reproaches, even a screaming match, but not this calm, annihilating contempt. "How dare you? I'm your husband!" he shrieked. "A legal misunderstanding that I intend to correct," Elizabeth retorted. She stood tall and slender, in a simple silk dress that looked more expensive on her than royal attire. She walked to the table, took the divorce papers, and without reading them, slowly and deliberately tore them into 4 pieces, and then into smaller and smaller shreds that fluttered onto the polished surface like poisonous snow. "There will be no divorce," she said quietly, but in a way that every word was seared into the stunned minds of Arthur and Barbara. Arthur was dumbfounded. "So, you agree?" Elizabeth laughed, a terrible, mirthless laugh. "Oh no, my dear, quite the opposite. I'm not going to share anything with you, because you will get nothing. Not a penny, not a speck of dust from this house." "That's illegal!" Barbara shrieked. "Everything acquired during the marriage." "Precisely," Elizabeth interrupted. She walked to the window and yanked the curtain aside. The evening city glittered with a myriad of lights outside. "Everything acquired during the marriage. But there is a small detail that, in your greed, you didn't even bother to consider." She turned to them, a strange, feverish fire burning in her eyes. "The thing is, my dear Arthur, that our marriage, it's not quite what it seems. And when I say it's time to end this show, I'm talking about a very different performance. And I assure you, the leading roles will not be mine." She paused, savoring the effect. "You see, according to the documents, you, my dearest husband, have been dead for 5 years." Chapter 2. The silence that filled the living room was thick and viscous, like cooling tar. Elizabeth's words hung in the air, refusing to register. Barbara made a strange sound, something between a sob and a hiccup, and her face turned the color of old parchment. Arthur simply stared at his wife, his plump lips moving silently, like a fish cast ashore. What nonsense are you talking about?" he finally managed to squeeze out. His usual arrogance had vanished without a trace, replaced by a primal, animal fear. Elizabeth returned to her chair and sat down gracefully. She picked up the book again, but instead of opening it, she simply rested her palm on its embossed leather cover. "5 years ago, remember, you got into mountaineering." Her voice was calm and narrative again, as if she were sharing a piece of gossip. "You went to the mountains with some group, and you disappeared. An avalanche, a tragedy, long and fruitless searches. To the rest of the world, to all official bodies, Arthur L. Sterling, my beloved husband, died tragically while pursuing his passion for climbing." She said it with such a casual tone that it sent a shiver down his spine. Barbara began to cross herself, her hand trembling. "But I'm here. Here I am." Arthur jabbed a finger at his chest, his voice cracking into a falsetto. "Here, yes," Elizabeth nodded. "But who are you?" "A man with no documents, no name. A ghost. Your social security number was voided upon your death. Your bank accounts are closed. You are a nobody. A specter who has overstayed his welcome in my home." A whirlwind of memories spun in Arthur's head. That trip to the mountains, he really did go. And there really was a small avalanche that cut their group off from civilization for a couple of days. But then everyone was found, alive and well. He returned home, and Elizabeth greeted him with such effusive joy, with such despair in her eyes, that he even felt like a hero. She cried, hugged him, said she had almost died of fear. And then this strange game began. She had persuaded him to lie low. She explained it with some mythical problems with competitors, threats saying they wanted to kidnap him to pressure her. Softened by her sudden affection and frightened by her stories, he readily agreed. Life in a golden cage, where he had to do nothing but exist, seemed to him the pinnacle of bliss. He never left their country estate, surrounded by a high fence and the latest security systems. Elizabeth said it was safer that way. She brought him books, movies, any delicacy he desired. Sometimes they went out, but always at night, in cars with tinted windows, and they never left the confines of private, gated properties belonging to her business empire. He had idly wondered why his mother had never once visited him in all those years, but Elizabeth explained that it was too dangerous to involve the elderly in such risky games. And to Barbara, as it now turned out, she had been paying a colossal pension for 5 years for her silence and for playing along in the grieving widow charade. And he believed it. He believed it because it was convenient, because it freed him from all responsibility. He was precious cargo that needed protecting. In reality, he was a puppet in a brilliantly directed play. You set this all up?" he whispered, his voice filled not with fear, but with the horror of realization. "Of course," Elizabeth smiled faintly. "It took the best lawyers, a lot of money, and a few compliant officials. But when it comes to protecting my assets, I don't skimp. My entire empire, every cent, every brick in this house was earned or purchased by me as a widow. You have no right to any of it. Legally, everything acquired during the marriage is in the past, buried under that avalanche along with you." Barbara finally found her voice. "Monster! You're a monster!" she screamed, jumping to her feet. "I'm a businesswoman, Barbara, and I protect my investments," Elizabeth replied coldly, "and you two were the worst investment of my life. Parasites I tolerated for far too long. But now, as I said, the show is over." She pressed a button on her phone. "And now, if you please, the exit." Her voice brooked no argument. "My security will escort you out. You have exactly 10 minutes to leave the premises. You may take only the clothes on your backs. Everything else is the property of the deceased and his grieving widow." The living room door opened silently, and 2 imposing figures in sharp suits appeared on the threshold. Arthur looked from them to his wife, his brain refusing to accept reality. He wasn't just divorced and thrown out onto the street. He was erased, annihilated, stripped of his name, his past, and his future. He was nobody, and that thought was more terrifying than any death. Chapter 3. Thrown out of the gates of what they just half an hour ago considered their home, Arthur and Barbara found themselves in the deafening silence of the exclusive gated community. Streetlights cast cold, lifeless reflections on the wet asphalt. The 2 silent security guards slammed the heavy wrought iron gates shut in their faces, cutting them off from the world of luxury and comfort they believed was theirs by right. She couldn't have. She had no right, Arthur mumbled, looking around in confusion. His expensive cashmere sweater suddenly felt cold. He felt naked, defenseless. Barbara, however, quickly composed herself. Years of petty intrigues and squabbles in academic circles had hardened her character. "The police. To the police immediately," she hissed, grabbing her son's arm. "We'll report her. Fraud, kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment." The idea seemed like a lifeline to Arthur. Of course, the law was on their side. The she-devil had gone too far. They would go to the station, he would present himself alive and well, and her entire elaborate scheme would crumble. After catching a ride to the nearest police station, they burst in, disheveled and agitated. The desk sergeant, a sleepy man with tired eyes, reluctantly looked up from his crossword puzzle. The story they breathlessly tumbled out, interrupting each other, sounded like the script of a cheap soap opera. Barbara screamed about a witch who had done away with her baby boy and now kicked them out onto the street. Arthur tried to look dignified, but his trembling hands and darting eyes betrayed his panic. "All right, sir. Your ID." The sergeant cut through their torrent of words. And then Arthur froze. I don't have it. She took everything. What's your name, sir? Arthur L. Sterling. The officer slowly typed the name into the computer. He stared at the screen for a few seconds, then looked at Arthur, then back at the screen. A look of bewilderment crossed his face. And Arthur L. Sterling, born in 1980, is listed in the database as deceased 5 years ago. An accident in the mountains. Here, there's a death certificate, number, everything in order. But that's me. I'm alive, Arthur pleaded. Mister, you're either drunk or out of your mind. The policeman frowned. Cut the circus act, or I'll book you for disorderly conduct. Listen, it's a conspiracy, Barbara intervened. His wife, Elizabeth Sterling, she orchestrated all of this. She's a famous businesswoman. She has connections everywhere. The name Sterling made the sergeant pause. He knew that name. The whole city knew it. Philanthropist, patron of the arts, one of the most powerful women in the country. All right. The officer's tone became harsh. You're both going to take a ride to a place where some specialist can talk to you. We'll also take your fingerprints, run them through all the databases. Maybe you're not Sterling at all, but some wanted fugitive who looks like him. Arthur felt the ground give way beneath him. A psychiatric evaluation? Fingerprints? He, a man from high society, would be sitting in a filthy cell with real criminals? Terror seized his throat. They were indeed taken away, not to a cell, but to the admissions ward of the city psychiatric hospital. A doctor, an elderly, tired man with intelligent eyes, listened patiently to their disjointed story for a long time. He asked questions, nodded, and took notes. Arthur tried to appeal to logic, to common sense. But the more he talked, the crazier his own words sounded. A man who had lived in isolation for 5 years, voluntarily cut off from the world, now claiming to be a resurrected dead man whose evil wife had stolen his fortune. All right, I understand, the doctor finally said. We'll keep you for a few days for observation. You need rest, peace, and quiet. They were led to separate rooms. Arthur's room was squalid, peeling walls, an iron bed with a lumpy mattress, and bars on the window. But the most terrifying thing was not the surroundings, but the thought that burned in his mind like a fiery brand. Elizabeth had thought of everything. She hadn't just stripped him of his money and status. She had stripped him of his identity. She had turned him into a madman in the eyes of the world. Any attempt he made to prove the truth would be dismissed as the ramblings of a lunatic. She had left him no way out. Lying on the hard bed, staring at the ceiling where shadows from the street lamp danced, Arthur felt absolute, bleak despair for the first time in his life. This wasn't just the end of the show. This was the end game. And he realized with horror that he had lost the game before it had even begun. But the worst was yet to come. The next morning, when he was awakened by screams in the hallway, he didn't yet know that Elizabeth had delivered her next, even more devastating blow. Chapter 4. The morning commotion in the psychiatric ward's hallway ripped Arthur from a heavy, anxious sleep. He sat up in bed, listening. The screams were female, hysterical, and in them he recognized with horror the voice of his mother. He ran to the door and peered through the small observation window. The scene before him was surreal. 2 orderlies in white coats were trying to drag a struggling and cursing Barbara into a treatment room. Her hair was disheveled, her face contorted in a mask of fury and fear. "What's happening?" Arthur yelled, pounding his fists on the door. "The patient needs a sedative," a passing orderly replied monotonously. "She's being aggressive, a danger to herself and others." "She's not crazy. Let her go." But no one was listening. The treatment room door slammed shut, and his mother's screams became muffled, then faded away completely. Arthur slid down the door to the floor, feeling a cold wave of helplessness wash over him. Elizabeth had gotten to them even here. She was turning them into actual patients, isolating them from each other, breaking their will with medication. A few hours later, he was summoned to see the same doctor who had admitted them. A thick folder lay on the desk in front of him. "Mr. Sterling," the doctor began, avoiding his eyes, "your situation is complicated. Your fingerprints are not in any database, which I suppose is not surprising for a law-abiding citizen. But we've received some additional information." He opened the folder. On top was an official letterhead from a plastic surgery clinic in Switzerland. According to these documents, 5.5 years ago, a certain gentleman, whose name we cannot disclose due to patient confidentiality, underwent extensive cosmetic surgery. The goal was to achieve the maximum possible resemblance to a Mr. Arthur L. Sterling, whose photographs were provided as a reference. The surgery, as you might have guessed, was paid for by Mrs. Elizabeth Sterling. Arthur stared at the doctor, uncomprehending. "What does that mean?" "It means," the doctor sighed, "that we have every reason to believe you are not who you say you are. Mrs. Sterling has provided us with irrefutable proof that the real Arthur Sterling is dead, and that you are an actor she hired, an imposter, one who apparently got too into character and decided to blackmail his employer for a share of her fortune. Your accomplice," he nodded toward the hallway, "was likely part of this plan. And she is now having a nervous breakdown now that your scam has failed." Arthur's brain refused to process this new, even more monstrous twist. An actor? An imposter? But he remembered his whole life. His childhood, school, college, his wedding to Lizzie. Or did he? Under the pressure of the shock, his own memories began to seem faded, unreliable, like someone else's. "That's a lie," he croaked. "She made it all up." "Perhaps," the doctor agreed unexpectedly. "Mrs. Sterling is a very powerful woman. But we have documents. You only have words that sound like the ravings of a madman or the elaborate lies of a con artist. Do you have scars behind your ears and along your hairline? They're typical after a facelift and plastic surgery." Arthur frantically felt his head, and he found them. Thin, almost invisible scars he had never noticed before. Elizabeth had once told him they were from a childhood fight, but now that detail fit into a new, horrifying picture of reality. "She even planned for this," he whispered. He realized that Elizabeth had been preparing this for years. Methodically, step by step, she had created a new identity for him, a new biography, while erasing the old one. She hadn't just declared him dead. She had manufactured evidence that he was a fake, a phantom of her own creation. "So, what will happen to me?" he asked, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Given your condition, we can't just release you onto the street," the doctor said with a shrug. And given the fraud allegations, the police will likely be very interested in you. But Mrs. Sterling, she has shown magnanimity. She is willing to drop the charges if you agree to voluntary treatment in a private, secure facility, somewhere far away, in the mountains. She is even prepared to cover your lifelong expenses on the condition that you forget the name Arthur Sterling forever and never appear in her life again. It was an offer he couldn't refuse. Either prison for fraud or indefinite commitment in a sanatorium for the insane. Both meant the end. Arthur looked out the window at the new day dawning. He saw a black, tinted-windowed limousine pull up to the hospital gates. Elizabeth emerged, dressed in an elegant pantsuit, her hair impeccable. She didn't look toward his window. She looked straight ahead, like a queen surveying her domain. And in that moment, Arthur knew the show was well and truly over. But the finale was far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined. And he had yet to learn of the last, most shocking act of this diabolical play. Chapter 5. The Aspen Meadows Private Clinic was located high in the Rocky Mountains, in the very same region where Arthur Sterling had died 5 years earlier, a cruel irony if fate had such a twisted sense of humor. In reality, it was just another detail in Elizabeth's flawless plan. The place where his story began would also be the place it ended. It wasn't a hospital. It was a luxury prison. Manicured lawns, obsequious staff in crisp white uniforms, gourmet food, and complete, total control. No contact with the outside world, no news. The patients, people like him, erased individuals, wandered the pristine paths like shadows, with vacant eyes and broken spirits. Arthur spent several months there. Time flowed differently, viscous and monotonous. He had almost resigned himself to his fate. His mother, Barbara, had been placed in a similar, though less luxurious institution somewhere in the rural Midwest. He would never see her again. He would never see anyone again. The name Arthur Sterling had almost faded from his memory, replaced by the nameless terror of existence. One day, on one of the gray, featureless afternoons, the clinic's chief physician came to see him. In his hands, he held a current issue of an international business magazine. On the cover was Elizabeth. She was smiling her dazzling, victorious smile. "Mrs. Sterling asked me to give this to you," the doctor said, handing him the magazine. Arthur took it. The headline beneath the photo read, "The Sterling Empire, a New Heir." He opened the article. It spoke of the company's tremendous success, its expansion into new markets. And then came the paragraph that made his blood run cold. The biggest news, however, came from the personal life of the Iron Lady of American business. 5 years after the tragic death of her husband, Arthur Sterling, Mrs. Sterling has announced the birth of a son. The boy, conceived through the latest reproductive technologies, using her late husband's preserved genetic material, was named Arthur in honor of his father. "I wanted my husband's legacy to live on," Elizabeth herself commented. "Now my empire has a rightful heir. Everything I have built will one day pass to him, to Arthur Sterling Jr." Arthur dropped the magazine. He couldn't breathe. The shock was so profound, it surpassed everything he had endured before. The picture was finally complete in all its diabolical perfection. She hadn't just erased him, she had replaced him. She had created the perfect version of her husband, a submissive, obedient child, completely dependent on her, who would inherit everything without asking any questions. She hadn't just taken his name and his fortune, she had stolen his very legacy, his future, his bloodline. She had created an heir to legally and morally cement her entire empire for herself and her offspring, completely writing him, the living but unwanted original, out of the equation. Her entire charade of his death was not just to get rid of him and his freeloading mother. It was the first step in a years-long strategy to create a new dynasty, the Sterling dynasty, where Arthur was relegated to the role of a genetic donor, a phantom whose name her son would bear. He, Arthur Sr., was locked away in a mountain clinic, declared an insane imposter, and Arthur Jr., his son, whose existence he had never even suspected, would grow up in his house, sleep in his bedroom, and one day become the master of everything he himself had so greedily coveted. This wasn't the end game. This was checkmate in an endless, perverse game where she alone set the rules. Elizabeth hadn't just ended the show. She had started a new, even grander one, in which he was cast in the most terrible role of all, the role of a ghost, forced to forever watch the triumph of his perfect replacement. Arthur looked up and saw his reflection in the dark window pane. A strange, tormented man with scars behind his ears stared back at him, and for the first time in months, he didn't scream. He laughed. A quiet, insane laugh of a man who had stared into the abyss and seen at the bottom his own perfectly engineered hell. The show was truly over, and the curtain had fallen, burying him beneath it forever. If you enjoyed the story, subscribe to the channel and you'll hear even more thrilling tales.